Welcome to our interview with Faith Holzart, Women's Wisdom Project, August 16th, 2016. Hey there. So a few weeks ago, I guess in June, we had a gathering where, Faith, you were talking about surviving and thriving through some of the things in your life, and one of the things that you mentioned was your relationship with your daughter, and it just was that's a journey in itself. And so I was hoping that you could talk more about your relationship with your daughter and where it has been and where it now is, and how that's really sort of informed and shaped your life.
Wow, that's an awful lot.
It is an awful lot.
Especially if you can. My daughter's 45 right now, and I'm 73. For about 17 years, I can't remember if I said that afternoon, she was totally out of touch with our family. I didn't know if she was alive or dead. So I may get weepy, but. And she was born early enough that her social security number was not on her birth certificate or her school records. So I really, even with the internet, I didn't know where she was. But anyway, she came back in touch about 9 years ago. She was in crisis. She had worked most of her from her very early 20s as a modern dancer in San Francisco and a lowly paid arts administrator. And eventually I'd say toward the end of the 90s maybe, I'd have to look it up, she, for whatever reason, left that world and eventually joined an evangelical church and married a man. She was raised Jewish and in fact did her bat mitzvah, anything Hebrew that you could do in her conservative bat mitzvah, she did in Hebrew, unlike her brother who hated it all. So she became an evangelical Christian. This was still when I didn't know where she was, and married a man, and they had 2 children who are now 9 and 11, something like that. And then at some point she left him, alleging abuse, and lived in the domestic violence system in San Francisco with her 2 kids for 7 or 8 months, and then had, as far as I know, her first hospitalization for mental illness. Her kids went to their dad, who lives just south of San Francisco, and she eventually went into the homeless system. I think kind of one of the dominant strands of the narrative, my narrative, is first of all looking at what does motherhood mean, but also what to do for a person who's very far away, who's often in danger, who's impoverished, whose reality is different than most of ours, and for who's living in a single-room occupancy hotel where a huge percentage of the other tenants are military vets, including young women. A lot of drug use in that location, prostitution, partying, violence, etc. So in addition to the fact that she doesn't have, like many people in San Francisco, does not have safe housing or housing she can afford, I have to pay for that room. The service system just has not met her needs at all. So she really is not in touch with counseling services. She's tried and often used a number of free community services, but those usually expire after 6 weeks or 3 months or whatever. She really hasn't had a complete medical workup in quite a while, although she hospitalized herself twice in the last year. Once she had been throwing up for months and really wasn't eating very well. And the most recent time she was paralyzed in her both legs, so they had to carry her out. And they sent her home after 3-4 days, and I think it was 4 years ago, it got into her record that the last time she was hospitalized before those two. So she really doesn't, unlike many people with serious mental illness, she really isn't in and out of the hospital 2 or 3 times a year. But 4 years ago, one of the diagnoses they suggested was something called somatic disorder, I believe. I can look it up. But anyway, it's where you experience all of the weight of physical symptoms, including swellings or paralysis, but there's no physiological basis that Western medicine can find for those symptoms, but they are life-threatening at times. And one of the counselor who was in charge of her care at that point said that this, maybe it's called a syndrome, anyway, somatic disorder, is associated with methamphetamine use. And it got into her record that there was a possibility of drug use. Now, I actually don't think, she's a former dancer, she's a lot of things about her body, but I think it's unlikely. I also think it's unlikely that I wouldn't have stumbled on more evidence, but that mention of either substance abuse, either alcohol or street drugs, followed her to the last 2 hospitalizations. And once they decided this is my take on it, once they decided she was psychotic and possibly a substance abuser, they let her go. So this last time, when she had been paralyzed in both legs, she had to be carried back upstairs by the ambulance people to her room because she couldn't walk. Now, she did get in-home services for about a week. I don't know whether it's something she omitted to do that they didn't come back, or that I think it's probably just inadequate services, honestly. But I think what's hard for me is, first of all, I understand I can't fix her problems. I can help her fix them. If she has no energy, or she's unable to walk, I don't actually know whether she's walking down the stairs. For a while she was really forcing herself to condition herself for a week, but then I haven't heard much from her for a week or so. But getting someplace to fill out forms or whatever is excruciating or unacceptable. And sometimes I think all she needs is like a few hours of home health service during the week. I mean, a lot of people would say she needs medication. She does hear things that the rest of us wouldn't hear. But mostly she manages that stuff. So I don't know. You're saying that I'm thriving and surviving partly because I've been physically sick for about 6 weeks. Really, I'm not sure I feel that thriving at the moment.
Well, so can you say more about, first of all, the kinds of health issues that you're struggling with and how you're sort of moving in them and with them? And also, I want to weave in the strand with your daughter and ask you how that has and continues to affect your life.
Well, kind of the long view, I broke my hip and part of my leg 25 or 26 years ago, and I got over that and basically compensated for about 25 years. But about 2 years ago, I realized I was just in constant pain. I couldn't even walk on the beach. I was in so much pain. And so I kind of said, well, I'm really, the damn demographic saying I might live for another 30 years. Sounds, with that much pain, I was going to be in a wheelchair most of that. So I did a series of Feldenkrais classes in Chapel Hill, and I started going to a massage therapist who works with pain. And I also kind of forced myself to increase my walking and swimming. So that, a lot of that is under control, or it's a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
I can, you know, there are things I know, like I can walk upstairs without holding on now, and I can walk up like an adult instead of that weird thing that little kids do. But then just more recent, so there's an ongoing issue with pain. I feel like I actually in the last 2 years have made tremendous progress in that, and my strength and balance. But then it just so happens, Vicki and I went to Europe at the end of June. I started feeling a little weird while I was away. Then we came back, and I wasn't like super sick, but I just didn't feel right. We went to West Virginia for a long weekend with all our kids except Carmela. And when I came back, I said, okay, I'm going to the doctor. And one of the first questions the doctor asked was, have you been bitten by a tick? And I was. I found a tick in the fold of my ear while we were flying to Europe. So I went through tetracycline. This was probably 3 weeks ago. And then, which really made me sick, tetracycline. Then, after about a week, it was clear I was still sick, so I went. They said, probably a sinus infection. So I did a round of a different antibiotic, and now I'm about a week after that, and I'm still not feeling great. So I went to the doctor. But for me, especially having had chronic pain all these years, I think it really affects my sense of self, in the sense of, you know, the stereotype of the old and feeble person. And so now I am like lingering around on the couch during the day and stuff. So that's been going on. And then in terms of the effect of Carmela being back in my life, first of all, most of the time, when things are good, we're in touch. She doesn't particularly like the phone or phone calls, although she goes through times when she does. Mostly we communicate by text. She's kind of off for various reasons having to do with her fears. She's off computers and like email, but she does text, and she actually uses her phone like a computer, really. So there's contact with her, which of course there wasn't. But then if she drops out of contact, especially knowing that a couple of times when nobody heard from her, she was actually in pretty severe crisis, means I spend some time being pretty anxious. Vicki and I send her money every month, or she gets $750 in Social Security disability income. In San Francisco, that doesn't get you, it wouldn't get you anything in the way of housing. You'd have to live and she has lived in homeless shelters, but they're not great.
Right.
The one she was in last, which was, she was in 2 parts. She was in a women's homeless shelter that was like 60 women sleeping on the floor of a church or a building. The bathroom was on a different floor than where they were all sleeping. And one of the people who was there had an ostomy bag and was in her 60s or 70s or something. So, and then she was moved into a so-called hotel that was run by the city for homeless people. San Francisco has a huge stock of old hotels. And there were and it was specifically, it was designated for people with mental illness, and there was staff that were supposed to help deal with that. Although I'm sure they were underpaid, and they were certainly overworked. So she was in that hotel, and there was a lot of violence there as well.
Well, so I know that you have a long history of activism, and you're also a published writer, and I'm wondering how the aging process that you're talking about and coming to terms with your mortality and the fact that you're not feeling well, and also having to deal with your daughter in situations where you're not in control and the systems that are supposed to serve her are not serving her. How do you, is there a way that they infuse your work? Like, are there ways that you can sort of take all of these feelings and what is going on in your life and use them? And if so, how are you doing that?
Well, yes. I'm actually working on I'm calling it a memoir in essays. And I had originally thought that I would frame it within 1 year of my life with Carmela, like from December of 2014 to the following year in December. I'm not sure that I'm going to keep that structure, but right now the essays kind of alternate with one another. Some of them are very close in, just this is the experience, this is what it smelled like, looked like, etc. Very experiential, but then alternate those essays with a slightly more logical, sequential. This is what Carmela's childhood was like. This is, West Virginia, etc., etc.
So we are continuing our interview with Faith Holsard as part of the Women's Wisdom Project, August 16th, 2016. And Faith, you were actually just talking about a memoir that you're writing.
Right. So, needless to say, because this has been so absorbing, it's also been a lot of my artistic energy has gone into this. So I do have a collection of poems, although I haven't been able to place them. And with both the poems and the essays, I have some questions about appropriation and consent. And when I tried to talk to Carmela about actually the poems, maybe 4 years ago, she said they were just too triggering. She didn't want to look at them. She didn't want to talk about them. But recently, actually, I have a series of texts in which she says she wants anybody who's been part of her life to write about what's going on. Now, I think she and I would dispute what literally has happened, or maybe not dispute, but she might not. She might be offended by the way I see some things. I don't really know. But and one of the things Carmela feels she is, and it feels right at times, is what used to be called the multiple personality. So just because I texted with somebody a month ago who said she wanted everybody to write what their experience of her situation, that doesn't mean that the aspect of her that I talk with today feels the same way. So we're all inconsistent. We all have lots of aspects. With her, it seems to be a little more systematic.
Well, I think that, one of the things that's very interesting to me in listening to you talk about your daughter is that you're not repeatedly using the word mental illness. The way
Right.
that you're communicating it is that she has a different perspective and a different way of looking at things, and that there are parts of her that feel one way and parts of her that feel another, which to me has a great deal more acceptance and compassion than a more conventional mental health approach,
Right.
which sees them as sick and us as normal. Which, as someone who is in a service provision, role, I think that that's a fundamentally more integrated way of working with people and loving them.
I think that's true, and I think if she were here in Durham, it would probably work. I think, but she's not coming here because of her 2 children. She spends, I mean, she's a very interesting person. She spends 10 to 12 hours most Saturdays and Sundays, unless she's too sick, with her kids who live in a suburb of San Francisco. She takes a cab out, which, I mean, lots of poor people use cabs. And then the ex-husband and the kids drive her home after dinner sometime, at some point. And like, her kids go back to school this Thursday, and the ex-husband, who knows what the story is, but he's bought tickets to a Giants game for Carmela and the kids and himself for Wednesday night. I don't know if she's well enough to go or not. I sometimes feel that she does too much housework when she's there, but the fact that she's a mother is very important to her. His house is kind of chaotic and disorganized, and I mean, he's a single parent for one thing, 5 days a week, and she wants her kids to have a slightly more orderly space. She also, I mean, with this ridiculously low income, has had $150 skimmed off the top that Social Security sends to him for the kid. I mean, this is her choice. She didn't have to do that. So anyway, I think she is interesting. I think in a kinder, gentler place like Durham or West Virginia, a cheaper place, for one thing, she could probably survive. I've really been concerned that she seems to be getting more and more in danger in terms of these last 2 hospitalizations. I mean, I think throwing up for 6 months is just dangerous.
Well, so how do you cope with the things that you really don't have control over? You know, whether it's your daughter's health and not being able to support her because you're not as close by as you would like, or dealing with your own health challenges, and I think you've, you know, without going into specifics until you want to bring them into the narrative, you know, there are many hurdles that I think you have jumped in your life, and many things that you have faced. So how do you deal with things that you cannot control?
Well, I talked to Vicky, my partner, who's my spouse, but I hate the institution of marriage, so I'll keep calling her my partner. I go out to the San Francisco Bay Area 3 or 4 times a year, usually, which is really expensive. It's complicated, but finding a place to stay, etc. Carmela's brother lives in Berkeley, but it doesn't work out very well to stay there, except maybe on weekends. He has a really small house, he and his wife. So seeing her going out there is a coping mechanism for me. I read, I Google, I'm thinking, although there are a lot of things about NAMI I don't like, which is National Alliance for Mentally Ill. I think if Carmela is in as much danger as I have felt she is in the last 6 months, that talking with NAMI people here about my situation may help, and that if it's possible to connect her with NAMI people there, or peers. I mean, it's the problem of getting her out of that room and out of that building and to a meeting, maybe not in her neighborhood. I mean, I think she'd do great in a peer support group, and she's a high achiever, so, you know, she probably, when she joined that evangelical church, she was like the star of Sunday school within months. I mean, partly because she knew a lot about the Old Testament.
Well, so it sounds like part of the way that you deal with situations that are not immediately under your control or that you can't fix is that you have to apply a certain level of perseverance, I'm hearing, like
Right.
constantly trying to find open doors and ways to make connections. And
Right.
Well, so if you look at your entire life as a mother, tell me a little bit about what that means for you.
Well, it's interesting. My mother, who I'm sure loved me very much, was definitely a 1940s mother. She wasn't, I don't know. She had her own issues. So in some ways she wasn't as affectionate, maybe. No, more than that, she was very critical. Partly it was the immigrant Jewish thing of wanting her kids to be the best at whatever they did. And she died when I was 31, so no way to continue that dialogue. But I kind of, in a 60s kind of way, I always thought, well, if my kids knew I loved them, and if I really loved my kids, then they could survive everything, anything. Divorce, poverty in West Virginia, which is where they spent their childhoods, even going to schools that were really inadequate. But I think, in retrospect, that was a little cavalier about the effects of things like the divorce, and maybe I Carmela has some memories that seem pretty sound of abuse by my first woman partner, actually. But I would not want that. So, I don't know. A family friend. And I didn't catch it. And I'm not beating myself up about it, but this was a critical event, obviously. Once she came back into my life, first of all, in the intervening 17 years, I'd become connected with Vicki, and then, and Vicki had 2 children who were, each was exactly 10 years younger than one of my kids, so in a way, a different generation, different type of kids. I was very judgmental about Vicki's handling, particularly of one of her kids, and I think pretty harsh with Vicki, not so much with the daughter. But once Carmela came back into my life, I really realized that there is something, you just can't violate that mother-child. I mean, you can say, Vicki, I really think she's out of hand, or, she's had traffic or whatever problems, but in the end, you just have to respect the integrity of the mother-child, even if they make mistakes, relationship. And so when Carmela came back and she was acting pretty crazy, and lots of people, I think including Vicki, had lots of opinions about she should be on medication, which she was for quite a while, off and on. She should be on medication, she should do this, she should do that. I realized that in the end, Carmela, of course, was the ultimate authority, but that there was an experience-based, my relationship with Carmela, that was different and had to be honored, and I really had to respect it. And then I was just glad she was back. I mean, she, like her brother, is a very interesting, smart, when she's doing well, person, and very familiar, which to me, because I left New York, that kind of Jewish community, and ultimately went to West Virginia, which is definitely, although there are Jews there, my kids were bar and bat mitzvah there, it's a non-Jewish environment, and I was a Yankee. I always felt I was a Yankee, and then I moved here, even more so in some ways. So my kids are profoundly familiar to me, partly because they are aware of, neither one of them is a Yankee, I think they both consider themselves Southerners, but they have an understanding that even 25 years later, Vicky doesn't necessarily get it. If I say something, she's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But so there's that family level of family culture. Vicky's family culture, and because her kids were growing up, they were young when we got together. Really, I feel like her family culture, which is waspy, etc., dominated. Or dominated is the wrong word. There was more weight.
Mm-hmm.
The world that we were moving in was more similar to where she grew up than where I grew up. And that doesn't mean that she was doing something bad or anything. It's just, and just little things like it went, for 14 years I was a vegetarian. And nobody in this household was. So it was always, oh, okay, well, what side dish am I going to make for Thanksgiving or whatever? But when I went to Jonah's house, and then Jonah and Beth, his wife, they were vegetarians for quite a while. It was like, oh, this is just so easy and familiar. Which didn't mean I wanted to leave Vicky. It just meant that there's a family culture thing that, I mean, you probably have it with the union, labor-centered stuff that you grew up with. So Carmela has a lot of that, and they also both, of course, knew my mother. Nobody. I mean, I don't know that Carmela really remembers her. Maybe not even Jonah, but they've met my sister. Vicky's met my sister too, and actually Vicky's kids have. But they have more of a sense of history, I think, with my family, just because when they were little, they met people who were no longer around to be met.
Right. Well, so if, you know, one of the things that that I'm doing with my mother, who of course you know, is, you know, she has such a wealth of experience and wisdom and all of the history that has helped shape her, and her loves and her struggles, and she doesn't always write them down.
Right.
And one of the reasons why this Women's Wisdom Project is happening, and why I feel like it's so important, is because, particularly for our elders, there has to be a systematic way that we can, you know, or a platform or something, a container to hold this wisdom so that it doesn't get lost and it can get passed on in some way to those folks who are coming up. And so one of the things I really like to ask people is, you know, what is your legacy? Like if this were your last day, which hopefully it isn't, but you know, what is your legacy? What is it that you would like to pass on or communicate to those who are coming up of varying ages?
I think I just have to ramble.
Rambling is okay.
We haven't mentioned that I was raised by two women, my birth mother, who was Jewish, and my mother by choice, who was African American, music teacher in the 1940s, and even in Greenwich Village that was unusual. So I think, and I've spoke before about how my birth mother tended to be very critical. Charity was not necessarily an easy person, my mother by affection, but I knew she loved me unconditionally. I always knew that. And so I think because of Charity, a little bit because of where I went to school, which was an unusual place where we studied Black history in 1954. Race, I really agree with W.E.B. Du Bois that I can't quote him exactly, and he was talking about the 20th, now I'm talking about the 21st, but something like the color line is the question of the 20th century. You know, I think there's some debts or understandings that we have to come to as a culture or society. In terms of, the Facebook has had a thing that circulated about, that's a graph of the number of years we had slavery in this country, the numbers of years of Jim Crow, and the numbers of years post-Jim Crow. And the space allotted to the number of years of slavery is just 2 or 3 times either of the other 2 times. And I think it's easy for us to not feel that, I guess. I think part of my legacy is probably the book Hands on the Freedom Plow, which is about women in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And my writing, probably.
Can you just talk briefly about some of the themes that you addressed in both your book and in the poetry that you've written since then?
A lot of stuff about West Virginia, the landscape, the coal mines, the houses, the dirt roads, the waterfalls, and then the book of both of them, that period when I really didn't know where she was. I didn't know if she was alive. I didn't know if she was dead. That period, time of absence. And then, of course, the time since then. So really grappling with what it is to lose a child, basically. I have a friend whose son committed suicide. And we always sort of saw, well, this was when I didn't know where Carmela was. But we saw one another as 2 sides of the same coin in some ways, because we had both lost our kids. But hers was irreversible.
So can you just rewind back in time a little bit to the book, and I'm going to have you say the name of it again, your first book about the women in SNCC. Can you talk a little bit about that book also?
Sure. Now that is absolutely not my book. There were 6 editors.
Okay.
It actually, the history of the book partly is that a group of white women wanted to write a book about their experiences in SNCC and approached me, and actually I think both of the other white editors of Hands. And I wrote a probably way too long letter about why I didn't want my SNCC memories in that context of all white memories. And sent it to a number of people, including some black people. And that letter, plus it was just time. So that would have been probably mid-90s. So we were all 30 years out from our SNCC experience. We were in our 50s, some a little older. The book basically, there were 6 editors, 3 black women and 3 white women. At this point, I think I would, even if it meant resigning, I would consider that editorial group should have been more black than white women. But regardless, that's how it was. And we put together all our little address book lists conference lists and drew up a list of about 300 addresses and names and sent out. And the way the book evolved, it traces, well, let me back up. We said you can write about whatever you want. If you don't know what to write about, here are some suggestions, including women's roles in SNCC, because there's been a lot of historical
And just for
controversy.
just for our interview, can you say what SNCC is?
Sure. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee,
Okay.
Which grew out of the Greensboro sit-ins. It's interesting as a sidelight that actually almost no one chose to write about how they felt underappreciated as a woman in SNCC. I think maybe one woman wrote about that, even though they could have written about whatever they wanted. So that to me was very telling, because so many historians have really, I feel, conflated that issue a little bit. Anyway, so we started getting pieces back, and it took a long time to figure out how to arrange it, but SNCC had a number of field projects, and they were really the heart of SNCC's work by the end. And we, all those English teacher questions, organized chronologically, organized by theme, blah, blah, blah. But we organized it kind of a little bit of both. And so I guess the end result, almost every piece was written by the woman herself. 6 to 10 of them, we just really wanted particular people, and so we interviewed them. And with the exception of McCree Harris from Albany, Georgia, who died before she could do this, all of them took the transcription and created their own piece. So it's in our own voices as opposed to, and it's not oral history, because, there was no controlling vision, really. But themes emerged. I think what's exciting to me is there are women in that book who are famous. There are 2 MacArthur winners there. Bernice Regan of Sweet Honey in the Rock, and a woman named Maria Varela, who's done work on macro or microeconomics, I forget which, in New Mexico. But then there are also women who went from being stalwarts of the Southwest Georgia movement to junior high school teachers in, where does Joanne teach? Somewhere in southern Alabama, where she teaches both black and white students. So people whose names might never be known, and some well-known people like Bernice, Mary Kane. There was one other thing I wanted to say about that. So it's a cross-section. It's women's own voices. It was really hard work. We had about twice as many pages as we ended up with in the originals, and we didn't want to change people's content, but we also knew we couldn't get a publisher for 1,500 pages of typescript. So I can't remember how big the final typescript was, but it was half that or even a little less. And it was just important to us that it was in our own voices, and that large numbers of Southern black women were part of the book. And those were some of the people that we had to kind of lean on or interview to get those interviews in. But that's who the movement was. I mean, people like me were there too. But often in the books and the histories, the people like me seem to have been the major influence, and we never were.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, and recently on Facebook, there were the year I was in Southwest Georgia, 12 or 15 middle school and high school girls. So these 12 kids were locked up in a stockade, and somebody photographed them and got the photos out, and it really looks like South Africa, Lesotho or something. But what I wanted to say was, in the last few months, there's been a drive to get Obama to award the Medal of Freedom to those. Get emotional again. Which would be pretty amazing. And I think actually they have like 27, they want 30,000 signatures, and they have like 27,000 or 28,000.
So when you say award the Medal of Honor to who?
Of Freedom, to the 12 or 15 girls who were in the stockade in Lee County, Georgia.
Wow. Wow.
So.
Can you say a little bit more about that for those folks who are not aware of what happened?
Well, you know, I really can't, I was there, but I can't quite remember how those particular girls were arrested that particular time. But that summer, which was also the summer of the fire hoses in Birmingham, the local high school and middle school kids, and even younger, were picketing one of the white stores in Little Harlem, which was the black side of town, and doing a number of other things. There was really a sense of anger and militance in 1963 that was pretty amazing. And however it happened, these 12 or 15 girls were arrested, and what often happened with the youngsters was, rather than put them in jail with adults, they would send them to outlying county jails. And this particular time they sent these girls to a stockade where I think there were no toilet facilities. It was just a bare floor. And what's circulating on Facebook right now shows the inside of that building today, which is still pretty bleak. And some of the women. So, and at least one of those women is in hands, Joanne Christian Mance.
So if there was a message that you would want to give people now who are fighting for justice in the ways that you have fought, what message would you give? What would you like to say to them?
Listen.
Can you say more about the listen part?
Well, I'm saying that to everybody, but especially to white people like myself. There's a lot of wisdom out there, but sometimes those of us with college educations or a certain kind of self-confidence don't allow space for other people's wisdom to emerge, and sometimes other people's wisdom is a lot better than ours. The slogan, something like, or not slogan, the idea of following black leadership, I still think is important. It's kind of been poo-pooed recently by certain anti-racist whites, but I still think it's important. I guess that's part of listening. And just remembering that the struggle began like with the first slave ship, or the struggle for, I mean, I still think of Jews as fighters for justice. I'm not sure the Jewish community in the United States earns that, but certainly Jewish struggles for justice also go back centuries. It's part of our history, so it's not, we aren't brand new, we didn't invent it. I think that's really, really important.
And what mother wisdom would you like to share?
Oh, I have no idea.
Like if you were having to support, and of course, you know, you do so much in the community that we haven't really touched on in terms of helping young people, and your work with Spirit House, which I don't know if you want to talk about, but you know, as a mother, there are so many mothers, and if you needed to say something to them based on your experience with Carmela and, you know, all of the challenges you've met in your life because of who you are and because of who you're married to, what would you say to them to sort of lift them up in difficult times?
I'm not sure I live this very well, but that people are not alone. Something I've really learned from community people that I know is that I can think of myself as having ancestors who can give me guidance, and that's placing myself in a context that's not just even not just the last 70 years, but longer ago than that. And then, I mean, I have, other than outright horror, I can't imagine what the mothers of the people who've been killed by police, what they must feel. So,
is there anything that you'd like to tell them or say to them?
No.
Yeah. So I think as our interview sort of weaves itself to perhaps a stopping place, is there anything that you want to share about some of the work you're doing in our Durham community here in North Carolina?
Well, I decided a few years ago that I didn't have the kind of 24/7 energy that I used to have. I think your mother probably is ahead of me on this, that she seems indomitable. And that I really couldn't, I mean, I could be in favor of, which I am, Jewish Voices for Peace, and I could be in favor of, which I am, stand up for racial justice, but that I really could only do one or two things and do them well. And probably if I weren't sending money to Carmela, I would send more money to groups that I can't put time in on. Song is another one. There are many wonderful groups. I really think a lot's going on. But I chose to play a support role to an organization, oddly, that I really can't be a member of, because it's, I mean, I feel very included, but I'm also not a black person, much less a black woman, and that would be Spirit House. And it's because they emphasize cultural work, I think, and also they have done a lot toward spreading the idea of the harm-free zone, which I think is a very important idea.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Because not everyone knows
Right.
what a harm-free zone is, and you have the sign right outside your house.
I do. You know, the quick version is that if we build the right kind of supports within the community, we shouldn't need police or prisons. But I think there's a lot of ground in between no prisons and what we have today. But I have been in the courtroom with Spirit House for a number of cases where people had been unjustly accused. Just being present. There was a woman a family here in Durham who last winter the police thought they smelled marijuana, and they totally tossed the family's apartment and shoved people around, etc. And somebody had a camera. I mean, why don't these police learn? But so I went to the court for that. I went for Carlos Riley. I was thinking I should go more often. So they support clean slate clinics, which have to do with erasing non-felony offenses from people's records. So they do a lot of work related to prisons, which I think are the new form of slavery. They have book groups, which have read some really interesting books. And they do harm-free zone training, which really is very intense. It's a cohort of about 20 people. Very diverse. I mean, by design, I think. I was in the most recent one. And then they do amazing cultural things like Collective Sun, and they did a video called A Bucket of Blood. I don't know if you saw that. But
no.
When the college kids were pouring buckets of water over their heads to fight ALS or something, raise money for something, they did a thing where 3-4 mothers poured. There was a lot of talking, I mean, an explanation, but basically poured buckets of blood over their heads. They made something with Kool-Aid or...
Yeah, I think I've actually seen snippets of that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And they're also, working with people, young people who, some of whom are just at that age and demographic where they're right in the crosshairs. So keeping them safe is pretty amazing.
I think one of the things that's really striking me about talking with you is that you very much see yourself as part of a collective
Mm-hmm.
and not just an individual.
Right, I think that's true.
Which I think is a really important wisdom teaching
Mm-hmm.
about who are we and how are we in relationship to other people around us,
Mm-hmm.
and not necessarily needing to be at the center.
Right, right.
And that also speaks to how we need to work together and love together and get things done, that we're sort of inseparably connected to a larger whole that's not just about us.
Mm-hmm.
So I just really want to honor that in some of the things that you've shared today.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that they're, especially in the 60s, maybe less so now, maybe not. There were these, especially, I think they were men. I can't think of quite the right word, but they were white men who kind of were like these extra special people who, I mean, there were a number of them who, it's kind of the lone wolf
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
approach, and I think that that's a really bad approach, maybe especially if you're white. I mean, sometimes people get pushed into that. I think Reverend Barber and Moral Monday is an interesting example. He's unavowedly a top-down kind of guy.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things that I just wouldn't want to do as an organizer, but he does get stuff done. He does. So, I mean, probably we need both kinds of organizing approaches. But I'm not really big on top-down organizing.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.